Fog slid low across the ground as if trying to smother the path leading up to the Fairfax estate, swallowing the last traces of daylight before anyone could turn back. The mansion loomed at the top of the hill, its windows dim and clouded, like eyes that had seen too much and refused to forget. People in town claimed the house had grown quieter over the years, but the kind of quiet that wasn't peace at all, more like the patient inhale before a scream. The discovery of the unrecorded burial began not with a dramatic revelation, but with something far more mundane, a damp, dust-filmed box found in the back of a forgotten records room in the county courthouse. It had been shoved beneath shelves sagging with brittle files, its corners softened by decades of moisture and neglect. Inside were scraps of correspondence, bits of early land surveys, and a thin leather-bound register whose spine cracked like brittle bone when opened. What first appeared to be just another deteriorating ledger became the quiet spark that ignited a far darker truth. The handwriting inside was elegant but shaky, dated nearly a century before, its ink weathered into an almost rusty brown. On one of the last pages, wedged between property tax notes and scribbled names, lay a single entry that made the room feel colder: burial, North Grounds of Fairfax Estate, unrecorded by request of family. No name. No details. Just that line, written with a trembling urgency that implied the writer wanted to record it but feared doing so openly. When the discovery was brought to the attention of the small historical society in town, most members dismissed it as a clerical error, the kind of slip that happened often in the era when records were kept by candlelight and personal grudges dictated more than professional duty. But the phrasing "by request of family" held a strange weight. The Fairfax family, even then, had held enough influence to make officials look the other way on anything they chose to hide. That alone wasn't surprising. What unsettled the archivists was that there was no corresponding burial record anywhere else, no church entry, no cemetery note, no obituary, nothing. Whoever had been buried on the estate that day had been erased cleanly, deliberately, and completely from every official document except that one trembling line. Curiosity pulled a few of the more determined researchers to dig deeper into the Fairfax history. They combed through census lists, diaries, letters exchanged between neighboring families, even yellowed newspaper clippings preserved by townsfolk who never trusted important stories to government archives. They expected to find some mention, however small, of a death that aligned with the timeframe of the ledger. But every attempt led them to the same unsettling conclusion: no one in the Fairfax lineage had been reported dead that year. There was no missing servant, no unaccounted-for relative, no suspicious disappearance publicly noted. It was as if the burial had been of someone who officially did not exist, someone whose presence was so precarious the family refused to acknowledge it even in death. As whispers spread around town, older residents began sharing hushed speculations passed down through their own families. Long before the mansion became a looming shadow on the hill, the land itself had carried a reputation for swallowing secrets. Some spoke of a child, an illegitimate Fairfax offspring rumored to have been born with disturbing abnormalities that the family refused to disclose. Others suggested the body belonged to an outsider, perhaps a traveler who had stumbled onto the estate at the wrong time, or a hired worker who had witnessed something he shouldn't have. The most unsettling theory was the one whispered only when the lights were low, that the burial had not been of a person at all, but of something the family had tried, and failed, to hide beneath the soil. None of the theories seemed complete. None explained why the family would go to such lengths to erase even the memory of the burial. Driven by growing obsession, 2 local historians gained rare permission to visit the Fairfax estate itself, hoping to locate the area described as the North Grounds. The mansion had long been unoccupied, the last of the family line having fled under circumstances the public still didn't fully understand. The property had fallen into a state of eerie preservation, as if the house remained frozen mid-breath, waiting for its inhabitants to return. The grounds were overgrown with waist-high grass and tangled vines, but the north slope was different. The vegetation there grew thicker, almost unnaturally dense, and the soil beneath their boots felt softer, as though something below had recently been disturbed, even though decades had passed. What caught their attention most was a patch of ground shaped almost too perfectly like a rectangle. The earth had sunk slightly, forming a shallow depression that stretched the length of a human body. No gravestone marked the spot, no wooden cross, no symbol to identify who or what was buried there. Just soil that had settled unevenly over time, betraying the presence of something hidden. One historian knelt beside it, brushing away leaves and loose dirt, revealing a texture in the soil that didn't match the rest of the grounds. Soil that looked sifted, deliberately turned over by human hands. The other swore he felt the temperature drop, an inexplicable chill seeping up from the earth itself, as though whatever lay below had not yet gone cold. Local officials later forbade any excavation, citing preservation regulations, though some suspected deeper motives tied to old loyalties and older fears. The land was left untouched, but the story of the unrecorded burial began spreading through the town once more, stirring conversations that had been silent for generations. The Fairfax estate, which many believed had finally lost its grip on the community's imagination, began to feel alive again, alive in a way that unsettled even those who had never believed in curses, ghosts, or restless spirits. The single line in the ledger, once ignored as a trivial anomaly, became a seed of dread planted within the minds of everyone who heard it. It suggested that the Fairfax family had not simply hidden a death, but had entombed a secret so dangerous they were willing to erase an entire human existence to keep it buried. The locked room had been a point of fascination long before anyone from town stepped foot inside the Fairfax estate. Workers who had maintained the property in its prime recalled passing by its door with hurried steps, never daring to linger. Servants once whispered that the family forbade anyone from entering it, even housemaids entrusted with every other room. The Fairfax children were warned to stay away as well, though children being children, some had attempted to disobey those instructions, only to be dragged back by their parents with a fear so sharp and uncharacteristic it left the children too shaken to try again. Over the years, the door's heavy iron bolts rusted into place, sealing it so completely that even the most determined intruder would have struggled to force it open. So when the family abandoned the estate, most assumed the room would remain locked forever, a sealed relic of a mystery no one could solve. It wasn't until the mansion stood empty for nearly a decade that the odd reports began trickling in. At first, they were small details. Hikers who wandered close to the estate swore they heard a faint tapping coming from somewhere inside the house, though they insisted no one else was there. A pair of teenagers who dared each other to approach the building claimed they heard something shift behind one of the upper windows, but dismissed it as an animal nesting in the ceiling. These early accounts were easy to ignore. Old houses made noises, everyone knew that. But then a groundskeeper hired briefly by the bank responsible for the property returned to town pale and shaken, insisting he had heard footsteps behind the bolted door as he swept the hallway. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone pacing in a confined space. The man quit halfway through his first week and refused to return even to collect his remaining pay. When investigators eventually gained access to the estate, they were naturally drawn to the locked room. The bolts were stiff with age, fused to the wood in places where rust had eaten through the edges. It took 2 men using crowbars to force the top bolt open, and another nearly an hour to pry free the lower ones. Every movement echoed down the empty hall, stirring up dust that had lain undisturbed for years. As the final bolt fell loose, a windless draft brushed across their skin, a brief current of air that felt too cold, too pointed, to be merely shifting atmosphere. When the door finally creaked open, the room beyond was revealed to be stark and barren. No furniture. No markings on the walls. No sign that anyone had ever lived there or used it. Yet a fine line of dust traced across the floor showed a strange pattern, a curved path, almost like the arc of someone pacing from one side of the room to the other. There was another detail that unsettled the investigators far more. The dust near the center of the room had been disturbed recently, so recently that it looked as if something soft and light had brushed across the surface. A sleeve. A hand. A foot. They could not agree. But they all knew it wasn't caused by them, since they hadn't entered yet. One man knelt to examine the dust more closely, and as he leaned down, he swore he heard a low, rhythmic sound vibrating through the wall, something between a hum and a sigh, as if someone was pressed against the other side, exhaling in long, exhausted breaths. The others heard nothing, and for a moment he doubted himself. But when he placed his hand on the wall, the surface felt faintly warm, as though recently touched by a living body. Word of the room spread quickly, and with it came new theories. Some believed a family member had suffered from an illness and been hidden away, kept out of sight to maintain the family's reputation. Others whispered about darker possibilities, that someone had been locked inside against their will, perhaps for years, kept alive just long enough for their mind to unravel in the suffocating silence. The most unsettling theory, spoken only by those who knew pieces of the estate's older legends, suggested that the room had not always been locked to keep something out, but to keep something inside. Not a ghost in the usual sense, but an imprint of something that once lived there, something that had not realized time had passed or that the world outside had changed. A presence that continued to pace its small domain out of habit or despair. Over time, more disturbing signs were found. On one visit, the investigators noticed that the dust along the far wall had shifted into long streaks, as if fingers had dragged down its surface. On another visit, the bolts, previously removed and left on the floor, were found placed neatly back against the wall, aligned in a perfect row. No one admitted to moving them. No one had reason to. A camera left overnight malfunctioned within hours, its footage dissolving into grainy static the moment the lens pointed toward the room. The following morning, the door, which had been left slightly ajar, was found pulled shut. Not fully closed, but not as it had been left. As if something inside had tried, weakly or instinctively, to close itself back into isolation. Each of these details, on their own, could be dismissed as tricks of an old house, accidents of nature, or the fears of people who had spent too long in a place steeped in centuries of dread. But together they formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. The Fairfax family had locked the room for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it was clear that the room had not forgotten its purpose. Even entered of secrets, it carried the memory of something that had once moved within its walls, something that had paced, breathed, and pressed against the door long after the bolts had sealed it away. The last Fairfax heir was not someone the town had expected to speak at all. For decades, the family had been shrouded in silence, a lineage of wealth and influence that seemed to evaporate into myth as soon as their name was spoken aloud. Tales of their eccentricities were told quietly, usually behind closed doors in taverns or whispered by mail carriers who had delivered letters to the estate for decades. The heir who survived, Margaret Fairfax, the youngest of the final generation, had vanished from public view long before the estate itself fell into disrepair. Her absence was a riddle that townsfolk had long accepted as part of the Fairfax legacy. Then, without warning, a letter appeared, addressed to the Town Historical Society but sealed in the unmistakable Fairfax family crest, the wax emblem cracked but intact, as though it had been waiting for the perfect moment to surface. The letter carried no return address, no date, but the handwriting was unmistakable, the heir's own elegant, deliberate script. Its tone was not formal, nor was it apologetic. It was a confession, a warning, and an invitation all at once, a combination so rare it drew both fascination and fear. The letter began with recollections of the family's past that no outsider should have known. Margaret described scenes of the estate from decades ago, the corridors that never stayed silent, the heavy doors that seemed to close themselves behind people who dared enter, and the strange rules that governed the family's every action. These were not ordinary eccentricities of an old lineage, they were rituals and restrictions imposed with a precision and severity that suggested fear as much as control. Margaret's words carried a weight far beyond mere memories. She wrote of things that went unspoken, of nights where shadows moved against the light, of whispers that drifted through the halls and called the names of those who were unworthy or unwanted. Most chilling of all was her admission that the estate itself had become a participant in the family's life, its walls and floors acting almost as extensions of the family's will, shaping behavior, punishing curiosity, and preserving secrets with a subtle cruelty no outsider could perceive. Reading the words, it became clear that Margaret herself had been both a prisoner and an observer of this strange, living architecture, a witness to the hidden mechanisms that defined her family's legacy. Midway through the letter, the tone shifted. Margaret admitted that the family line carried something ancient, something that was not merely metaphorical. She used words that unsettled even the most skeptical reader, a hunger older than the soil, she wrote, a debt we inherited with our name and our blood. She did not elaborate fully, but the phrasing suggested that the Fairfax family had been bound to the estate in a way that exceeded property ownership or social obligation. It implied a relationship that was predatory, almost symbiotic, where the house itself demanded attention, ritual, and sometimes sacrifice, and the family provided it willingly, or as willingly as they could. The passage left little doubt that Margaret had grown up understanding that leaving the estate was never truly an option. One could depart physically, she hinted, but the pull of that legacy lingered, tugging at bloodlines and memories, whispering warnings in dreams and waking hours alike. The heir described attempts to escape the family's influence, detailing moments when she had tried to walk away, to start anew in a life unconnected to the Fairfax name. Each attempt, she explained, had been met with inexplicable obstacles, sudden storms that blocked roads, illnesses that confined her to bed, friends who vanished mysteriously just as she attempted to confide in them. These were presented not as coincidences, but as warnings, small punishments administered by something unseen, something that the family had long understood and feared. Margaret's own words betrayed a mixture of awe and terror. She had grown up knowing the estate would follow, remembering, pressing, ensuring that no one escaped its dominion entirely. Her confession was remarkable because it treated the house not as stone and timber, but as a sentient force capable of memory, desire, and judgment. Every anecdote she included reinforced the idea that the family's fortune, their influence, and even their tragedies were not accidents or products of human choice, but consequences of a larger, darker intelligence. Towards the end of the letter, Margaret's prose became urgent, almost pleading. She warned that outsiders should not attempt to enter the estate, that curiosity could awaken forces that were patient but merciless. She spoke of doors that should remain closed, corridors that should not be traversed, and rooms that were more dangerous than death itself, for they retained the echoes of the past in ways that could consume those unprepared for it. She hinted at events that had occurred long before she was born, incidents the town had ignored or forgotten, and suggested that these were not isolated tragedies but part of a repeating pattern that linked every generation of Fairfaxes to the estate's enduring hunger. The letter closed with an ominous note, almost a prophecy, that the house woke when they tried to leave and that any attempt to ignore its rules, even decades later, could have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate walls. It was a warning that the family's history was not just a story of wealth and influence, but of an intricate, living system of control that persisted beyond human lifespans, a pattern of behavior and consequence that the estate itself enforced. The letter's appearance sent ripples through the town and among scholars of local history. For the first time, the Fairfax legacy was not simply a matter of rumor or second-hand storytelling. It was a personal account, delivered from someone who had lived through its most intimate horrors and understood them fully. Margaret's confession made it clear that the family had never been simply wealthy or influential. They had been custodians and victims of something older, something sentient, something embedded into the very architecture of their home. The word suggested a blend of fear, resignation, and responsibility, a complex acknowledgement that the legacy they inherited was not theirs to refuse, and that it had shaped every choice they had ever made. To read her confession was to understand that the Fairfax estate was not merely a house, but a repository of memory, desire, and predation, and that the last heir had lived her life knowing the weight of that inheritance, bearing it in silence until the day she could speak it aloud for the first time. The night of collective hallucinations began quietly, almost imperceptibly, as if the house itself were holding its breath before unleashing a long-suppressed memory. Those who had gathered at the Fairfax estate that evening arrived with a mixture of skepticism and morbid curiosity, armed with flashlights, recording equipment, and notebooks to document what they assumed would be nothing more than an abandoned mansion's natural creaks and groans. Among them were local historians, thrill-seekers, and one or two paranormal investigators, each with a personal interest in unraveling the Fairfax legacy. The air outside was thick and still, a fog pressing against the edges of the clearing as if unwilling to let anyone approach. The trees surrounding the estate stood like silent sentinels, their branches scratching against one another, whispering warnings that no one dared decipher. Even before crossing the threshold, an uneasy feeling had settled over the group, the kind of premonition that makes the spine tighten and the skin prick as though anticipating a truth too vast to confront. Inside, the mansion seemed almost alive, every floorboard groaning under their weight, the walls exhaling dust and memories in unison. The group moved cautiously, their flashlights casting long, trembling shadows that flickered across the ornate, decaying wallpaper. At first, all was consistent with their expectations: cold drafts, warped floorboards, faint echoes of the past. Then subtle anomalies began to emerge. One member thought she glimpsed a figure standing at the top of the staircase, only for it to vanish when she blinked. Another swore he heard whispers behind a door, voices low and urgent, but when the group approached, the room was empty. These were small, easily dismissed phenomena if viewed individually, But as the night progressed, a creeping sense of coherence began to form, a pattern that suggested these were not random, nor were they hallucinations born solely of fear. Something in the house was responding to their presence. It began with the most basic senses. The group reported a sudden drop in temperature that wasn't uniform, but localized, shifting from room to room as if an unseen entity were moving through the mansion. A faint metallic smell appeared in the air, sharp and unsettling, mingling with the familiar decay of wood and dust. Footsteps echoed in rhythm with those of the living, yet they could not be traced to any source. The investigators noted that these sounds seemed to anticipate their own movements, as though the house itself were orchestrating an invisible ballet around them. When they split up, each member experienced a version of the same phenomenon. Rooms rearranged themselves subtly, walls seemed to stretch or contract, and shadows danced just beyond the reach of their lights. The effect was cumulative, feeding into the next, until reality itself felt porous, pliable, and unstable. Then came the hallucinations, collective, undeniable, and horrifying in their precision. All 5 members of the group, though separated at that point, began to see the same visions, figures pressed against walls, staring through windows, their faces contorted with despair or anger. Whispers became words, words became sentences, and the sentences became demands. Names were spoken with an intimacy that could only come from memory, the voices calling the group members' names as if they had been expected for generations. At first, the investigators assumed this to be a product of fear and suggestion. Then one of them realized that all 5 had described the same sequence, the same phrases, and the same gestures, despite being apart. The realization struck them with a cold certainty: whatever was manifesting inside the mansion was operating outside the bounds of individual perception. The house had imposed a shared vision, a synchronized hallucination, and it was deliberately showing them something it wanted them to see. The visions themselves were not static. They evolved, layered with grotesque familiarity and subtle menace. The figures seemed trapped between the walls and the floorboards, sliding silently, pressing against surfaces, and peering through corners where no one could exist. They reenacted moments of history, fragments of conversations, arguments, and cries, all distorted by time yet unmistakably tied to the Fairfax family. The participants felt as though they were being drawn into the scenes, pulled along by unseen hands or threads of memory that looped through the mansion like spider silk. It was not violence they first perceived, but anticipation. The rooms themselves seemed aware that the intruders were learning too much, that knowledge itself was a threat. Then the hallucinations escalated, moving from passive observation to an active presence, the figures stepping closer, reaching through floors, walls, and ceilings, their voices merging into a chorus that demanded recognition, repentance, or surrender. Physical sensations accompanied the visions. Each person experienced cold touches on arms and shoulders, a brushing of hair or cloth that had no visible source. One investigator swore he felt a hand clamp over his mouth, while another felt the floor shift beneath her feet as if trying to sweep her toward the basement, the place where the family's most guarded secrets were rumored to lie. The lights flickered and dimmed in patterns that synchronized with the hallucinations, and cameras recorded static bursts as if the house were actively resisting documentation. Attempts to speak to one another were frequently interrupted by simultaneous speech from unseen entities, voices overlapping their own, repeating their names, or whispering phrases from long-forgotten conversations. The collective nature of the experience became more apparent. Even the skeptics, hardened by years of dismissing stories of hauntings, began to tremble and falter, realizing that the house had engineered a shared perception for its visitors, shaping their thoughts and senses with meticulous precision. The most unsettling aspect was the way the house seemed to feed off their reactions. Fear heightened the clarity of visions, confusion strengthened the persistence of figures, and doubt allowed them to linger longer than they naturally would. The participants were drawn deeper into hallways and rooms they had no intention of exploring, led by phantasms and whispers that anticipated their decisions. It became clear that the estate was aware of its observers, actively testing them, observing how they processed each manifestation. The night stretched, each hour a layer of shared delusion that drew the group closer to an understanding they were unprepared for. The mansion's past was not merely remembered, it was relived, enforced, and extended through anyone who dared step inside. These hallucinations were not an accident, nor were they benign. They were a mechanism of the house itself, designed to teach, punish, and integrate all who entered into the fabric of its memory. The awakening beneath the foundation was not something that arrived suddenly, but rather something that had been building for decades, fed by centuries of suppressed memories, secrets, and unacknowledged deeds. The Fairfax estate had always been an imposing structure, its walls standing taller than necessity required, its foundation sunk deep into the hill as if attempting to pierce the very earth itself. Neighbors had long commented on the strange vibrancy of the grounds, noting that trees near the estate grew faster than their counterparts elsewhere, that vines seemed to coil in purposeful patterns, and that small animals either avoided the property entirely or appeared in numbers too large to be natural. At first, these were dismissed as quirks of soil and weather, or as coincidences amplified by the estate's looming presence on the hill. But those who dared approach with scholarly curiosity, or worse, with the intention of investigation, would discover that the estate's energy, its peculiar vitality, was not limited to the structures above ground. It emanated from below, a living memory, a pulse in the very earth that had accumulated over generations, waiting for the right disturbance to release it. It began subtly, with tremors in the soil that no seismic map could account for, tiny movements beneath the floors of the house that were imperceptible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. Investigators reported a sensation of the ground itself breathing, a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction that seemed almost synchronized with the heartbeat of the living. Dust swirled without wind, and faint vibrations traveled through walls and staircases. When the most sensitive equipment was placed on the floors, readings fluctuated unpredictably, indicating motion that could not be attributed to mechanical failure or human interference. The phenomena escalated when exploratory holes were drilled along the outer foundation. The soil below was warmer than the surrounding earth, not simply sun-warmed, but actively emitting a low heat as though it had absorbed centuries of life and memory. Attempts to dig deeper were met with sudden collapses of soil, almost as if the earth itself resisted exposure, reburying whatever lay beneath in a protective, instinctual response. It became clear that the foundation was not inert, it was alive in a manner that defied conventional understanding. Strange occurrences were reported by those who ventured into the basement and crawl spaces. Shadows moved along walls independently of light sources, echoing the shapes of figures that no human could cast. Water in puddles and drains vibrated subtly, forming patterns that resembled faces or symbols when viewed at just the right angle. Footsteps could be heard in areas where no one had set foot, descending and ascending the stairs in perfect mimicry of human gait. Items left unattended would sometimes vanish and reappear in impossible locations, as if transported by unseen hands. The further one descended, the more tangible the sense of awareness became, until it was no longer a matter of imagination. The estate's foundation had memory, consciousness, and intent. The pulse in the earth beneath was not simply energy, it was recognition, responding to the presence of intruders, recording their actions, and shaping their perceptions. The awakening itself was first noticed by a small group of historians and paranormal investigators who had returned to the estate, determined to map the substructure after hearing about the previous strange phenomena. While placing sensors along the northern foundation, one of them felt a sudden tremor underfoot, a vibration distinct from the regular hum of the earth. Within moments, the others reported feeling it as well, a synchronized pulse moving from one side of the estate to the other. The sensation was accompanied by a low-frequency sound, barely audible, a resonant growl that seemed to rise from beneath the rocks and soil rather than from any mechanical source. Instruments detected fluctuations in magnetic fields, inexplicable shifts in temperature, and bursts of electromagnetic activity that could not be linked to electrical equipment. The investigators realized, almost simultaneously, that the ground itself was responding to them, awakening in the presence of conscious observers in a deliberate manner. As the pulse intensified, other effects manifested. The soil beneath certain areas of the house seemed to shift with a slow, purposeful motion, forming depressions and ridges that mimicked the contours of human movement. Dust and debris danced along invisible currents, and faint imprints appeared on the floorboards above, as though someone, or something, was walking beneath the surface and pressing against the foundation to make itself known. The vibrations began to resonate with the participants' own bodies, inducing a vertigo-like sensation and a disorienting sense that time and space were stretching and contracting simultaneously. Footsteps that had long been heard in the hallways now seemed to originate from below, echoing through the floors in a manner that suggested a mass of hidden presence, pressing against the very floors the intruders walked upon. Even the air itself seemed charged, tingling with an energy that defied explanation, leaving the investigators both terrified and enthralled. The awakening revealed the estate's deepest secret, that whatever had haunted the Fairfax family for generations was never confined to the walls or the rooms above ground. It was rooted, literally, in the very earth they had built upon. Beneath the foundation, the soil retained the memory of every tragedy, every burial, every act of concealment and cruelty the family had committed. The pulse that rose through the floors and walls was the earth remembering, the house enacting the collective consciousness of generations long gone. When objects shifted on their own, when shadows moved, and when footsteps echoed, it was not simply the work of spirits or hallucinations, it was the estate interacting with the physical world, asserting its presence and influence in ways both subtle and undeniable. The investigators understood that they were not merely intruding on a property, they were intruding upon a living repository of history, bound by an intelligence that had absorbed and preserved every fragment of human action it had ever witnessed. The consequences of the awakening were immediate and disorienting. Those present reported shared visions that transcended ordinary perception, glimpses of the family's past played out beneath the foundation like dioramas of living memory. Scenes of despair, rage, and quiet, methodical cruelty were projected into consciousness with a clarity that defied logic. The pulse beneath the earth seemed to synchronize with these visions, amplifying their intensity, making the participants feel as if they were standing within the memories themselves rather than observing them from a distance. The realization that the foundation had agency, that it could remember, respond, and influence, recast everything about the Fairfax estate. It was not merely haunted in the conventional sense, it was sentient, a repository of collective memory and will that had endured long after the family itself ceased to occupy the house. The awakening beneath the foundation confirmed the truth that the Fairfax estate's power had never resided in its walls, furniture, or even the living descendants of the family. It had always resided in the earth beneath, patient, deliberate, and now fully awake to all who dared step upon it.